El oak, que es el roble, que está en el medio de la casa, ese lo planté yo, de la estatura mía. My name is Humberto Calzada. I was born in Havana, Cuba in 1944. I always thought I was going to be an architect. When I came to the United States and I finished high school and I was ready to enroll at the university, I realized that the architecture field was quite difficult at the moment, and it still is. And I was quite sort of dissuaded by the counselors to go into that field, and they talked me into becoming an engineer. I became an engineer, and then I went for a master's degree in finance. When I finished and started working on the field, I realized I had no vocation whatsoever for being an engineer. And then all my old interests in art, in architecture, in more intellectual pursuits surfaced, which I think they had been dormant all those years because of the dismal economic situation in which we found ourselves, upon arriving in the United States.
Estaban de muerto porque se murió el suegro de la hija de Gloria. Iban a ir a la funeraria, pero dice Víctor, mañana nos vemos al desayuno y el almuerzo va, porque yo no voy a ningún entierro.
Esta es una de las viejas que desayuna conmigo.
Porque yo no sé lo que le dirá Gloria. ¿Ok?
My father was 43, my mother was 37 when I was born. So I'm the youngest of three siblings. My father was a very overprotective person, always obsessed with seeing dangers everywhere. And for that reason, I wasn't the type of kid playing out in the street with other kids and all that. I would stay playing at home by myself long periods of time. And perhaps because I was alone for such prolonged periods of time is that I became such an observant child. I became like obsessed looking at reflections in the floors or any shiny surface. I became very conscious of light and shadow. I became very conscious of the reflections of stained glass on the walls. Anything that reflected, I sort of became very aware of. And maybe that's the reason when I started painting, the main theme of my work has always been, those big doors that I remember from childhood, the reflection, floors that show reflections, the reflection of the stained glass, the wrought iron windows, all those things that in a way I'm trying to recapture my cultural past. I grew up in a family where, on my mother's side, people were very much interested in art and collecting antiques having to do with Cuba specifically. On my father's side, it wasn't like that, but they were pretty much interested in Cuban history and pretty much indoctrinated me into becoming and feeling very Cuban. The Havana, I remember, was a very vibrant city. It had many different lives going on at the same time. It had a fantastic nightlife. It had a fantastic cultural life. It had a fantastic economic life. I know there were problems like political problems and other kinds of problems like every country has, but this was a very, very fortunate city. And a separate chapter were the Cuban women. They were extremely conscious of their looks, extremely conscious of wearing the latest fashion. And, in fact, there was a corner of Galeano and San Rafael, it was called the corner of sin, where older men would go there on Saturdays, especially Saturday afternoon or Friday afternoon, just to watch, a lady watch, just see the women going by and maybe expressing a piropo, which is like a praise of the women or whatever. But a lot of men would do that because there were several cafes around, and they would have maybe a coffee or something for a while, and then go and stand in the corners to see the women go by. My wife left Cuba in May of 1959 with her family. She was 11 at the time. They left in the ferry, city of Havana, which left Havana for Key West. My father-in-law had the great idea of having his camera in his hand. He started taking pictures the minute the boat left the dock, and the boat has to go like a mile inside the harbor of Havana until it reaches the Morro Castle, and then it starts in the open sea and turns a little bit towards the west. And so he kept alternating between left side and right side. He took all the buildings of the port, and then the La Cabaña, El Morro, all these other buildings. And then he starts taking pictures from the open sea towards the city, and the boat keeps getting further and further away until he takes the last picture. Is you can see the tall buildings of Vedado, very small, right at the very end. The reason I paint architecture, and I specifically inspired in the architecture of Cuba, is I think I'm trying to reconstruct. I've been trying all these years to reconstruct a visual past. I always say that when we arrived from Cuba in 1960, shortly thereafter we had almost everybody we knew from there was here. We had the food because Cuban markets emerged pretty soon. We had the music because several radio stations were already broadcasting in Spanish and broadcasting Cuban music. But visually what we saw was very different to Havana. Miami at the time was only like 60 years old, and we're missing the 400 years of cultural tradition that Cuba had. The old churches, the old plazas, the old palaces that were built during the colonial times, the flavor of the old homes, all that was missing. Las reuniones del Bakery, pues mira, son como unas sesiones de terapia de grupo espontánea. O sea, ahí va gente, los que nos reunimos ahí hace 14 años que nos estamos reuniendo en el Bakery para desayunar, todo el mundo tiene sus problemas y se ventilan ahí, y después que se ventilan se tiran a relajo y se ríe uno de todo el mundo y de uno mismo y sale un poquito ya con la carga un poco más liviana, ¿no? Y a la vez también, o sea, tratamos de mantener la tradición del desayuno en un lugar público como un punto de reunión y de conversación y todo que se hacía en Cuba y que aquí se ha ido perdiendo. O sea que es parte de las dos cosas, ¿no? Aparte yo creo que inconscientemente estamos tratando de mantener la tradición de la cubanía un poco.
cuando piensa en mí.
Tiene que subir los ojos.
Un barrio a 70 y pico, que los viernes por la tarde van todos los balseros ahí a levantar viejas. Y entonces a las viejas le dicen las hermanas al rescate, que levantan balseros ahí en la...
Yo no quiero.
Y ella está loca por ir toda.
Contigo me voy, mi granja, aunque me cueste morir. No me quieres dejar. Yo no quiero sufrir.
No es otra cosa más
Contigo me voy, mi granja, aunque me cueste morir. Yo quiero la cosa. Y yo no quiero sufrir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir.
A ella le gusta
Yo sí, yo
salir
soy.
en la tele. A ella le gusta salir en la tele. Como es Alexis.
Oye, pero no me tomes tan de cerca, por favor. Aléjame la cosa. Esto es precioso.
So I started painting as a hobby. I took up, sort of to make my life a little more pleasant, since I didn't like the work I was doing. I took up painting as a hobby. And from there, it evolved into I would start dedicating more and more time to painting. And until I decided, well, this is what I want to do. So I'm completely self-taught. I never took a lesson. One of my favorite Cuban artists is Amelia Peláez. And the reason is she does an abstraction of the Cuban visual imagery, which I do in my work. I try to do it with realism. She does it in an abstraction. Like, for example, she captures the colors of the stained glass. The black lines represent the wrought iron work of Cuba. She also, this is a very simple one, this work on paper that I have in my house, but on more bigger works or bigger canvases, she does represent, like, sometimes the stained glass arch, and she has the moldings on the ceilings of the interior of Cuba that were all elaborate and carved in in clay. She does represent like fruits and sometimes even furniture and everything, just with the black lines and color. And it's a very beautiful way, and you can immediately identify something that represents Cuba very well. The other painter that I really like is Carlos Enriquez, because he does like some transparencies in his, like he would paint a portrait of a man and a horse or whatever, but then the horse is kind of transparent, you see through it. I really, and the treatment he gives to the Cuban countryside with the palms moving with the wind. Yeah, I think the revolution has interrupted the creative process, because any creative process or artistic process in which the government puts its hand, and sets up parameters that have to be followed, and it intervenes, I think loses the originality of a movement. And they produce good art, but sometimes I see the art that's coming out of Cuba now. It doesn't look Cuban at all. It's very much influenced by what's happening abroad. Although they don't have official access to magazines, art magazines, and all that, but I guess they receive them and they see them and all that, and I don't recognize it as really Cuban art. It's just, of course, they're living in a different environment also, so it's sometimes people say, well, what they're producing now is like a reaction to the place where they're living and the conditions they're living under. The first 4 or 5 years was what I would call the anecdotal period, which was just trying to reconstruct my memories of the houses and the architectural places I remembered. After a few years of that, I decided, well, let me start experimenting with creating more surreal scenarios, like more resembling like a theater scenario, where I would have stairways going nowhere, where I had maybe the stained glass was missing from where it was, and I had it on the floor. I started hearing rumors and some pictures that Havana was really falling apart. So I started creating some imaginary ruins, some very clean, idealized ruins, painted in my style, but you have these arches that all of a sudden were truncated. I had truncated columns lying down on the black and white floor, always with the ocean behind and all that. The next period is what I call meta art. I started using old paintings that I had produced before, using them in my new paintings. Like maybe I would have a certain number of walls, and in one of them you had an old painting hanging there. So as to create a even more surreal spirit within the painting, and also to create, using what I read about symbology. I like to work with symbols. I realized that the flood had a dual meaning in symbology that was very appealing to me. Number one, it signifies the greatest disaster. When you have a flood, it's the greatest disaster. But water means purification and rebirth. So I like that dual meaning to apply to Cuba with a sense of hope. I say we're going through a great disaster, but maybe we could emerge as a better nation after so much suffering. Then after that, I did a very short, maybe a year, I produced homages to other painters. I either painted a famous painting of the painting I was doing the homage to in my style, or I would do a space of mine, and in that I would hang a painting of the painter I was doing an homage to. Then the next, I read a poem by Jose Marti, which is called Dos Patrias, or two motherlands. And it says, I have two motherlands, Cuba and the night. And I found that poem so beautiful that I started to investigate what it would look like to have my spaces, but at night, with with the lanterns, illuminating the space and all that. Last year, 2008, I returned to Havana for the first time in 48 years. It was, I consider myself first an Habanero and then a Cuban. I love my city more than I love the rest of the country. I think it was a most wonderful city. It was beautiful, and that's the way I remembered it. It was quite a shock to land there and discover the state of ruin in which that city has become. So I started taking some pictures with the idea of doing something with them. At the same time, a cousin of my wife, who's a photographer, Vicky Zamorano, and another friend of mine, Rafael Fornés, an architect, had taken photos of these ruins of Havana. So, and they gave them to me to use as I wanted. So I started experimenting with the idea of deconstructing the ruin. In other words, trying to paint over the photographs what Havana was like before this decay started, or what Havana could look like if someday, people have the will to reconstruct and make it look like a normal city again. What I did is just take part of the photograph and reconstruct it, always leaving part of the ruin as a witness to the disaster that occurred. What I keep in mind when doing this is I'm trying to keep the spirit of what I remember Havana was like. I'm trying to use the colors that I remember and basically the beautiful sensation of seeing those buildings, when they were in a normal state of care. Pero espérate, porque lo voy a poner a pintar para acá para estar, porque si no, no estoy en el foco, ¿no? Que tú querías. Ok. In this project of the reconstruction, perdón, empiezo otra vez. In this project of deconstructing the ruins of Havana, this one in particular is very dear to me. It's a very personal one. This is the house where my grandmother used to live in the Vedado section of Havana. And I visited the house last year when I went to Cuba. I took this picture. Of course, at the moment, I wasn't planning on doing this project, so I wish I had taken the photo more squarely frontal. But anyway, when I developed the picture, it immediately felt the desire to reconstruct it to the state in which I remembered it. You know, when I was a child, I would visit this house 2-3 times a week. I remember, playing in the yard in the front and the yard it had in the back. I remember, very, very vividly, I remember every room in the house. I wasn't able to get in, but just from the outside, I was able to relive all those moments again. That's a home I would never leave again, or never even go inside. But still, it produces me a lot of satisfaction to be able to restore it, even if it's on campus. It's an illusion, but I'm trying to restore it the way it was. I was thinking that maybe there's a relationship between my desire to stop the decay of Havana and a subconscious desire to stop the decay myself, like a certain age we start thinking of our own mortality, and there must be a definite relationship between this work, trying to stop the decay in Havana, and trying to stop the decay myself. Oh yeah, it's an impossible quest, but it's worth trying though. No, it is impossible. The Cuba we all love is in our minds. That Cuba doesn't exist anymore. You can go back there and you'll find some of the sites. You'll find still the beauty. You'll find everything, but it's just a different country. We will never be able to go back to the Cuba. That will always exist in our minds, in our thoughts, in our heart, but it will never come back.